In a faraway corner of the galaxy, there existed a civilization that was unlike anything humans had ever imagined. They were called the Zeltharians, a race of highly intelligent aliens who had lived on their planet Zelthera for countless generations. Zelthera was a world of breathtaking beauty, with skies that shimmered in green and blue hues, forests that glowed faintly in the dark, and oceans so deep that sunlight barely touched the bottom. The Zeltharians themselves were tall and slender, with translucent skin that reflected their emotions, and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. Life on Zelthera had always been harmonious. The Zeltharians were known for their knowledge of advanced technology and their ability to live in balance with nature. They had built cities that floated above forests, powered entirely by clean energy, and their scientists had mastered the art of traveling within their own solar system. For countless years, they had thought of themselves as secure, as if nothing in the universe could threaten the delicate equilibrium they had achieved. But one day, everything changed. Out of nowhere, violent cosmic storms began to erupt in their skies. These were not ordinary storms. They were enormous bursts of raw cosmic energy, twisting and tearing the atmosphere, shaking the very foundations of the planet. Entire cities that had floated for generations suddenly wobbled dangerously. The forests that had always been serene began to ignite spontaneously. The oceans, calm and serene for thousands of years, started forming gigantic whirlpools that threatened coastal settlements. The Zeltharians had never seen anything like it. Scientists and researchers rushed to understand the cause, but their most advanced instruments could not detect the source of this sudden chaos. It was as if the universe itself had turned against them, testing them in a way they had never experienced. Panic began to spread across the planet. In their history, the Zeltharians had faced natural disasters before, but nothing on this scale. Entire communities were at risk, and traditional methods of defense and survival were useless against the raw force of the storms. Families fled their homes, trying to find shelter in the underground cities, but even those were at risk as tremors shook the planet. The leaders of Zelthera, a council of the wisest and most experienced Zeltharians, held emergency meetings to try and find a solution. They debated endlessly, trying every possible idea from manipulating the planet's magnetic field to redirecting energy from their cities. But nothing seemed capable of stopping the destruction. The Zeltharians were intelligent, innovative, and calm under normal circumstances, but the severity of the situation forced them into a state of collective fear. Every day, the storms became more violent. Every day, they lost parts of their cities, their forests, their lives. The council realized that if they did not act quickly, their civilization might not survive. For the first time in their history, the Zeltharians were confronted with a problem beyond their control. A problem so vast and dangerous that it could end their entire species. It was during this period of unprecedented desperation that the council made a decision that had never been made before in the history of Zelthera. They would reach out to other civilizations in the galaxy, asking for help. Though the Zeltharians had always considered themselves relatively isolated, they knew of other intelligent species scattered across neighboring star systems. They had always maintained contact through occasional scientific exchanges, but never in a way that required urgent cooperation. Sending a distress signal to an unknown civilization was risky. They had no idea how others would respond. Would they be helped? Would they be ignored? Or worse, would someone see their vulnerability as an opportunity to attack? Yet, the risk of doing nothing was far greater. They had no choice. The council quickly assembled the finest communications specialists and engineers on the planet. Together, they designed a signal unlike anything ever sent before. It was a combination of advanced mathematics, universal symbols, and a message that conveyed the immediate danger they were facing. This was not just a technical procedure. It was a plea for survival, an emotional outpouring encoded into electromagnetic waves capable of traveling the immense distances of space. The Zeltharians worked day and night, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, and ensuring the message would survive the journey through the cold void of the galaxy. As they worked, families huddled in shelters, hoping that somehow their message would reach anyone who could save them. Finally, the signal was ready. It was launched into space, a brilliant flash of light and energy carrying the essence of the Zeltharian plea. The council and the people of Zelthera watched the skies as it departed, carrying with it their hopes and fears. The signal traveled across light years of empty space, racing toward distant stars and planets, seeking intelligent life that could respond. There was a tense, almost unbearable silence after the launch. Days passed, then weeks. The storms on Zelthera continued to rage. Despite the terror, the Zeltharians clung to a fragile hope that someone out there would see their distress and come to their aid. Little did they know that the signal did not go unnoticed. Far beyond the reaches of their galaxy, a formidable and infamous race intercepted the plea. The Deathworlders, a civilization known across multiple star systems for their sheer power and fearsome tactics, received the transmission. The Deathworlders were unlike the Zeltharians in every way. Where the Zeltharians valued knowledge, harmony, and survival, the Deathworlders valued strength, strategy, and domination. They were warriors of unmatched skill, and they rarely interfered in the affairs of other species unless it served their interests or tested the limits of others. When they intercepted the SOS from Zelthera, they did not see a simple plea for help. They saw a challenge, a puzzle, a test of worthiness. For the Deathworlders, the concept of sending help was not simple. They did not offer mercy lightly. To them, a civilization that asked for assistance was a civilization that needed evaluation. They would respond, but not with compassion or diplomacy. They would respond with force and scrutiny. Their fleets, massive beyond comprehension, could move across galaxies, striking fear into any species. Yet, as they received the Zeltharian signal, a sense of calculated curiosity took hold. Who were these aliens calling out for help? Were they weak and unworthy, or were they clever and resilient enough to survive trials? The Deathworlders began to mobilize, their ships aligning, engines humming, weapons systems charging. What the Zeltharians intended as a plea for aid was about to become a test of endurance and intelligence on a scale they could never have imagined. Back on Zel, life continued in a fragile balance of fear and hope. The people had no knowledge of who or what was listening to their message. Families prayed, scientists worked tirelessly to understand the storms, and leaders tried to maintain calm among a terrified population. The planet seemed to be caught in a paradox. The more they hoped for help, the more desperate their situation became. Every night, the green skies of Zelthera lit up with violent flashes. Every day, the forests and cities endured unrelenting destruction, and the oceans churned with deadly whirlpools. Yet, despite all of this, the Zeltharians held on to the belief that someone would come. That belief, fragile as it was, became their lifeline, their reason to keep moving forward, and the spark that would drive the story of survival to unfold. As the SOS traveled further into the galaxy, it carried not just a warning but a story of a civilization on the brink, reaching across the vast emptiness of space in search of help. And somewhere, far away, the Deathworlders watched and listened. They did not see helpless aliens. They saw a species about to be tested in ways it had never experienced. And so, the stage was set for a cosmic encounter that would change the Zeltharians forever. Their plea for survival, their cry into the infinite void, had not gone unanswered. Something was coming, and it would challenge everything they knew about courage, intelligence, and the very meaning of survival itself. The Zeltharians had sent their SOS into the vast, empty reaches of space, hoping, praying, that anyone would hear it and come to their aid. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of help. Yet the distress signal did not go unnoticed. Far beyond their star system, the message reached beings unlike any the Zeltharians had imagined. These were the Deathworlders, a civilization infamous across galaxies for their immense strength, ruthless discipline, and unparalleled military power. Unlike the Zeltharians, the Deathworlders were not nurturers, not helpers, and certainly not merciful. They were warriors, trained to see weakness, challenge, and opportunity everywhere. When the Deathworlders intercepted the SOS, they did not simply see a request for help, they saw an invitation for a test. Within hours of receiving the message, the Deathworlders began mobilizing. Their fleets were enormous, so vast that they could consume the space around a small solar system with ease. Ships with armor stronger than any known material, armed with weaponry capable of destroying entire cities in minutes, began moving towards Zelthera at speeds that the Zeltharians could hardly comprehend. Each ship was a fortress, equipped with advanced sensors, artificial intelligence, and deadly automated defenses. The Deathworlders were not just coming, they were coming prepared for anything. Their approach was not a casual gesture of assistance. It was deliberate, calculated, and designed to make the Zeltharians confront the enormity of the universe and the fragility of their own existence. Back on Zel, the skies remained violent with the energy storms, yet the people still held on to hope that their SOS would be answered. Scientists and leaders monitored space, scanning for any sign of an approaching fleet. Days passed, and then a subtle change began to occur. A tiny glimmer appeared in the distance, a faint light that grew steadily brighter, larger, and more intimidating. At first, the Zeltharians thought it might be another cosmic anomaly, another storm or gravitational fluctuation. But as the light grew and formed shapes that moved with intention, it became clear that something was approaching, something immense, structured, and terrifying. Panic quickly spread. The Zeltharians had never seen anything like it. The approaching fleet was massive. Each ship was larger than the biggest floating city on their planet. Metallic and black, they shimmered with an almost organic energy, like living machines prepared for war. Their engines emitted a hum that resonated across space and into the planet itself, shaking the ground with invisible waves of energy. The Zeltharians could feel the presence of this fleet even before they saw it fully. Fear spread through the cities. Families huddled together. Emergency protocols were activated. The leaders tried to maintain order, but even they could not hide the terror in their voices as the Deathworlder fleet approached. It became clear that their arrival was not peaceful. The ships did not slow down. They did not hover at a safe distance. They surrounded the planet, creating a near-impenetrable orbit that blocked out the light of Zelthora's sun. The The Zeltharians, who had hoped for saviors, now faced the overwhelming reality that they were being observed by one of the most fearsome civilizations in existence. Communication signals were sent from the Deathworlders' ships, but not in a language the Zeltharians understood. Instead, they received vibrations, pulses, and patterns, messages of dominance, not dialogue. The Deathworlders were not here to negotiate. They were here to test, to evaluate, and to assert control. The leaders of Zelthera convened an emergency council. They knew that panic would destroy their chances of survival. They needed to understand the motives of these alien forces, and they needed to organize their people. The council discussed every possible scenario, from immediate attacks to forced occupation. They considered fleeing underground or attempting to hide in remote regions of the planet. But the sheer size and scope of the Deathworlder fleet made such plans almost pointless. Every option was risky. The Zeltharians were intelligent, but they had never faced a force like this before. This was not merely a challenge of technology or strategy, it was a test of courage, adaptability, and resilience under pressure, the likes of which they had never imagined. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders began a series of controlled maneuvers. They positioned their ships in ways that cut off access to vital areas of the planet. They deployed smaller drones and reconnaissance units to observe the Zeltharians' reactions. It quickly became apparent that the Deathworlders were not attacking randomly. Every move was deliberate. The destruction that occurred was precise, targeting specific areas of instability to test the Zeltharians' ability to respond. For example, one of the floating cities was exposed to a minor gravitational disturbance, threatening to topple it. The Zeltharians had to act quickly, coordinating emergency teams to stabilize the city. Elsewhere, the storms above a major forest intensified suddenly. Scientists had to find a way to shield the ecosystem and prevent it from spreading fire to nearby communities. Every challenge was designed to test their intelligence, cooperation, and composure under stress. The people of Zelthera were terrified, yet something remarkable began to happen. Where fear could have caused chaos and disorder, it instead sparked ingenuity. Communities that had never worked together before began to organize themselves. Scientists, engineers, and even children contributed ideas. Emergency response teams worked in shifts around the clock, using tools, technology, and their knowledge of the planet to stabilize dangerous areas. Families helped each other evacuate from unstable zones. Leaders communicated constantly, coordinating efforts across the planet. The terror of the approaching Deathworlder fleet, instead of paralyzing the Zeltharians, forced them to act with a level of unity and intelligence that they had never experienced before. The Deathworlders watched everything with clinical precision. They were assessing not just the survival skills of the Zeltharians, but their creativity, adaptability, and willingness to cooperate under extreme pressure. Each action taken by the Zeltharians was logged and analyzed. The Deathworlders were ruthless in their evaluation, but not in a way that caused unnecessary death yet. They wanted to see potential, not destruction for its own sake. And the Zeltharians, despite their fear and desperation, began to show that they were more than a simple species in need of rescue. They were capable of growth, problem-solving, and courage in the face of unimaginable odds. At the same time, the Deathworlders' presence exerted an intense psychological pressure on the Zeltharians. Their every action was observed, every decision scrutinized. People felt the weight of invisible eyes, the knowledge that a single mistake could have dire consequences. Yet, rather than breaking under the stress, the Zeltharians began to develop a kind of disciplined focus. Panic was replaced by methodical action. Fear became motivation. Communities learned to anticipate the Deathworlders' movements, creating strategies to stabilize areas before disturbances could strike. Scientists developed early warning systems for storms. Engineers reinforced vulnerable structures, and leaders coordinated evacuations with meticulous precision. Through it all, the Zeltharians began to change. They learned to act not only for themselves but for the survival of the entire species. They discovered strengths they had never recognized, both in individuals and in the collective society. People who had been timid and reserved in ordinary life became decisive, resourceful, and courageous. Communities that had once been isolated now functioned as a single organism, united by the urgency of survival. Children learned to help in ways that saved lives. Elders contributed wisdom that guided strategy. And scientists and engineers pushed the limits of technology to stabilize the planet. The presence of the Deathworlder, as terrifying as it was, acted as a catalyst for this transformation. Yet the Zeltharians still had no understanding of who the Deathworlders were or what their ultimate intentions might be. They knew only that these beings were immensely powerful, and their arrival had changed everything. The SOS they had sent to the universe, once a simple plea for aid, had become a call that attracted the attention of a force capable of judging and testing them. And as the Deathworlders continued to observe, it became clear that the Zeltharians' survival depended not just on their ability to manage the storms or protect their cities, but on their ability to demonstrate intelligence, courage, and resilience under conditions that no species had ever faced before. By the end of this period, the Zeltharians were exhausted but stronger. They had endured their first encounters with the Deathworlders' fleet, surviving tests that had seemed impossible. They had learned to cooperate, to think creatively under pressure, and to face their fears directly. Yet even as they began to adapt, the sense of foreboding remained. The Deathworlders had not communicated their final intentions, and the Zeltharians knew that their trials had only begun. Still, hope persisted. Hope that the strength and unity they had demonstrated might one day earn the recognition and survival they so desperately sought. The stage was now set for an unprecedented encounter, a meeting of two civilizations, so different in nature that understanding each other would be nearly impossible. The Deathworlders had arrived, not as saviors, but as judges and testers. The Zeltharians were faced with the most difficult challenge of their existence, one that would require every ounce of courage, intelligence, and resilience they could muster. The universe had shifted beneath their feet, and nothing would ever be the same again. The arrival of the Deathworlders marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Zeltharians' history, a chapter defined by trials, adaptation, and the extraordinary potential of a species pushed to its absolute limits. The arrival of the Deathworlders had changed everything for the Zelth. What had once been a peaceful planet of learning, art, and harmonious living had become a stage for a trial unlike anything the species had ever imagined. The massive fleet of Deathworlder ships now orbited the planet in tight, calculated formations, blocking sunlight in some regions and creating shadows that seemed to stretch across entire continents. Their presence was overwhelming, and the sheer scale of their machinery made the Zeltharians feel like ants under a magnifying glass. Despite the fear that gripped every citizen, the people realized that this was no ordinary disaster they were being tested at first. The Zeltharians thought the Deathworlders were attacking. Minor tremors shook cities, and targeted energy discharges struck certain areas. Entire forests caught fire, and floating cities wobbled dangerously as controlled gravitational pulses were released. Panic erupted in the streets, and many feared that their end was imminent. But as the chaos unfolded, a pattern began to emerge. The strikes were not random. They were precise, targeting weak points in the infrastructure and natural environment. The Deathworlders were forcing the Zeltharians to respond, to prove their intelligence, cooperation, and resourcefulness. The people began to understand that these terrifying visitors were not simply killers, they were observers, judges of survival. The Council of Zelthara convened immediately. This was a turning point in their history. Leaders who had always dealt with planetary administration and scientific progress were suddenly faced with a challenge that combined every form of crisis imaginable. They had to save lives, stabilize infrastructure, control natural disasters, and maintain morale, all under the unrelenting scrutiny of an alien force whose judgment could be fatal. The Council divided responsibilities with incredible efficiency. Scientists were tasked with analyzing storm patterns and predicting where the next energy burst would strike. Engineers reinforced vulnerable cities and invented quick-deploy barriers to protect civilians. Military strategists, though traditionally unarmed due to Zelthara's peaceful nature, coordinated evacuation plans and ensured citizens could move safely to secure zones. What was extraordinary was how the Zeltharians adapted. Normally, the society prized individual achievement and specialization, but under pressure they learned to work as a collective organism. Knowledge that had once been siloed in research labs was shared freely across communities. Engineers collaborated with scientists to develop emergency systems, children assisted with communication networks, and elders provided critical guidance on problem-solving and resource management. Every citizen played a role. Fear, instead of paralyzing them, became a catalyst for unprecedented cooperation and ingenuity. They were no longer just individuals trying to survive. They were a civilization demonstrating its ability to endure under extreme conditions. The Deathworlders observed silently from orbit, their vast ships humming with energy and sensors scanning every response. They did not intervene unless absolutely necessary, allowing the Zeltharians to demonstrate initiative. This created a constant tension. Every decision, every action, could be scrutinized. Errors were costly, and the stakes were incomprehensibly high. For instance, one of the floating cities experienced a destabilization due to a concentrated energy pulse. Engineers raced against time to deploy emergency stabilizers, working together to calculate balance, deploy counterweights, and ensure the city did not collapse. Meanwhile, scientists coordinated with environmental teams to ensure that the resulting shockwaves did not trigger forest fires or oceanic turbulence. The city was saved, but the people understood that each success was temporary. They had to maintain constant vigilance. Simultaneously, natural phenomena on the planet added complexity to their struggle. The energy storms, initially mysterious and unpredictable, began to increase in intensity as if reacting to the population's responses. Lightning-like discharges struck randomly, and deep tremors shook the ground beneath cities. Coastal regions were battered by violent tidal surges, threatening low-lying settlements. The Zeltharians were forced to innovate rapidly. They built temporary shelters from reinforced materials, created emergency water barriers to control flooding, and even modified energy grids to redistribute power where it was most needed. In many ways, the planet itself had become part of the test, as the Deathworlders subtly influenced environmental patterns to observe the Zeltharians' adaptability. Amid all this chaos, Stories of courage and ingenuity began to emerge. Citizens risked their lives to rescue trapped neighbors. Young engineers devised systems that redirected destructive energy pulses safely into uninhabited areas. Entire communities evacuated forests moments before the lightning strikes, guided by scientists' predictive models. These acts were not just survival, they were proof that the Zeltharians could act decisively, creatively, and bravely under extreme pressure. It became clear that fear alone could not defeat them. They had to transform that fear into action, using intelligence and courage as weapons against the odds stacked so high against them. The psychological effect of the Deathworlders' presence was profound. The constant observation created pressure the Zeltharians had never experienced. They were forced to think not only about immediate survival but also about demonstrating strategic foresight. A simple mistake, misjudging a storm's direction, delaying evacuation, or failing to stabilize a city could mean catastrophic loss. Despite this, the people learned resilience. They adapted their routines, trained in rapid response drills, and developed communication systems that allowed information to flow instantly across vast distances. The society evolved in a matter of days, growing stronger, faster, and more efficient under conditions that would have broken them in the past. Even more remarkable was the way that Zeltharians began to think creatively under pressure. The Deathworlders' controlled strikes forced them to anticipate outcomes, test theories in real time, and make quick high-stakes decisions. For example, one of the energy pulses created a temporary magnetic disruption, threatening the stability of the floating cities. Scientists hypothesized that by using a network of conductors, they could redirect the pulse harmlessly into the atmosphere. Engineers constructed the network under extreme time pressure, coordinating with multiple teams simultaneously. The operation succeeded, and the city remained intact. It was a small victory, but in the larger context, it demonstrated that the Zeltharians could innovate under the harshest of trials. As days turned into weeks, the pattern of testing continued. The Deathworlders' presence was intimidating, yet it became clear that each attack was designed to push the Zeltharians to their limits rather than destroy them outright. They learned to anticipate the aliens' strategies, predict environmental hazards, and act with precision. The society developed an almost instinctual ability to respond to disasters before they occurred. Even the youngest citizens contributed, learning to communicate observations quickly and assist in emergency efforts. The Zeltharians were being molded into a species capable of handling extreme stress, and they were rising to the occasion with courage and intelligence that surprised even themselves. Amid these trials, a sense of unity emerged. Communities that had once competed for resources now shared everything necessary to survive. Knowledge became the most valuable currency. Scientists, engineers, and leaders worked together in a seamless system of coordination. Decisions were made collaboratively, and individuals who displayed extraordinary courage or intelligence were supported by the entire society. It was a transformation that might never have occurred without the pressure exerted by the Deathworlders. The planet, once divided into separate communities and who had become a single cohesive organism focused entirely on survival and adaptation. While the Zeltharians were learning and growing, the Deathworlders continued their silent evaluation. They observed not only physical responses but also social dynamics. They noted how citizens collaborated, how leaders adapted strategies, and how individuals demonstrated bravery under unimaginable stress. Every success, every failure, every creative solution was recorded and analyzed. The Deathworlders were not merely interested in survival, they were interested in potential. They wanted to see if the Zeltharians possessed qualities that made them worthy of existence in a universe filled with danger and competition. In the end, the clash of worlds, the unrelenting pressure of the Deathworlders against the resilience of the Zeltharians created a remarkable spectacle. The Zeltharians were terrified, yes, but they were also learning the true meaning of courage, intelligence, and cooperation. They were discovering strengths within themselves and their society that had remained dormant for generations. Each day of trial brought new insights, new victories, and new proofs that they could survive under conditions no civilization had ever faced before. By the conclusion of this phase, the Zeltharians had transformed. They had endured controlled attacks, environmental disasters, and constant observation without succumbing to despair. They had become faster, smarter, and more unified. Their courage had grown, their creativity had flourished, and their ability to adapt to extreme challenges had been tested to its limits. Yet, even as they celebrated small victories, they knew the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The Deathworlders had only begun their evaluation, and the Zeltharians would have to continue demonstrating intelligence, resilience, and bravery to earn the right to survive. The clash of worlds had begun, and the Zeltharians were no longer just victims, they were active participants in a trial that would define the future of their civilization. Every action mattered, every decision had consequences, and the entire species had learned that survival depended not on hope alone, but on courage, ingenuity, and the ability to rise under pressure. The universe was watching, and the Zeltharians were determined to prove that they were worthy of its attention. The days following the initial clash with the Deathworlders marked a turning point for the Zeltharians. The planet was no longer merely a battleground of storms and destruction. It had become a proving ground for the survival and evolution of an entire civilization. The Zeltharians had survived the initial chaos and had begun to adapt in ways that were both extraordinary and unexpected. Their society had become a living organism, functioning as a cohesive unit in ways that no one had thought possible. Cooperation replaced competition, intelligence overcame panic, and courage flourished even in the shadow of overwhelming fear. Every day was a test, and every action mattered. The Deathworlders observed silently from above, their massive fleet still dominating the skies. While they had inflicted only controlled, precise disruptions, their presence alone was a constant reminder of the stakes. The Zeltharians began to understand that survival was not simply about responding to disasters. It was about proving themselves worthy of existing in a universe where power and strength dictated who endured and who perished. The Deathworlders' purpose was clear. They were not saviors, nor were they conquerors at this stage. They were evaluators, watching, testing, and challenging the Zeltharians to rise beyond their limits. This realization changed everything. Fear was no longer the only driving force. It was now matched by determination. The Zeltharians understood that every effort they made to save lives, stabilize cities, and adapt to the storms was being measured. They had to demonstrate intelligence, creativity, and resilience. Teams were organized across every region of the planet, and each team had a specific purpose. Scientists predicted storm patterns with increasing accuracy. Engineers designed mechanisms to stabilize cities and forests, and emergency response units coordinated rapid evacuations. Children and adolescents were trained to assist with communications and emergency logistics, turning even the youngest members of society into essential contributors. The pace of adaptation was astonishing. Where previously problems had taken days or weeks to solve, now solutions were implemented in hours or even minutes. For instance, when one of the energy storms created sudden instability in a floating city, the engineers rapidly deployed energy dampeners while scientists monitored environmental variables. At the same time, emergency response units evacuated citizens to safe zones. The entire operation was synchronized, with each person understanding their role and executing it flawlessly. These coordinated efforts were more than just survival. They were proof of the Zeltharians' capacity for strategic thinking and collaboration under extreme pressure. The Death continued to push the Zeltharians further. They began to manipulate environmental challenges more subtly, testing not only technological ingenuity but also social cohesion and psychological resilience. One storm, seemingly harmless at first, was engineered to spread unpredictably through a dense forest, threatening to cut off communication lines between two major cities. The Zeltharians quickly realized that the solution would not come from technology alone. They needed coordination, trust, and foresight. Leaders from the two cities communicated in real time, sharing resources and guiding their citizens to safety, while engineers modified energy fields to contain the storm. It was a delicate balance of human ingenuity, technological skill, and communal trust. The psychological pressure of constant observation remained intense. The people of Zelthera were always aware that their every action was being watched, analyzed, and judged. One wrong move could cause unnecessary destruction, and any failure could mark them as unfit for survival. Yet, rather than breaking under this scrutiny, the Zeltharians began to thrive. They developed a sense of focus and discipline that had never existed before. Panic and hesitation gave way to rapid decision-making and calculated risks. They learned to anticipate potential disasters before they occurred, using both scientific knowledge and intuition, honed through repeated trials. What was most remarkable was the transformation of individual citizens. People who had previously been shy or timid discovered courage they had never known. Scientists who had worked only in laboratories began directing field operations, making split-second decisions that affected entire cities. Children became integral to communication networks, relaying information and assisting with evacuations. Elders, who had once held wisdom mainly in theory, applied their experience to guide strategies in real-time crises. Every member of society had a role, and every contribution was vital. The Deathworlders' presence had forced the Zeltharians to evolve not just collectively, but individually. Communities also began to innovate in ways that had never been attempted before. New technologies were developed under extreme time constraints, often combining fields of study that had previously been separate. For example, engineers and environmental scientists collaborated to create dynamic shelters that could move with storms, while energy specialists developed predictive algorithms that allowed entire cities to anticipate environmental fluctuations. These innovations were not merely temporary solutions. They represented a fundamental leap in Zeltharian knowledge and capability. The challenges posed by the Deathworlders were acting as a catalyst, accelerating the evolution of the entire civilization. Despite these extraordinary achievements, the Zeltharians remained acutely aware of the stakes. The Deathworlders did not intervene directly, but their observation was omnipresent. Citizens knew that success would be measured not only in lives saved, but in the manner in which they acted. Intelligence, creativity, adaptability, and courage were all under scrutiny. Every decision mattered. One failure, even if small, could have devastating consequences. This constant awareness created a heightened sense of responsibility, forcing every individual to think beyond immediate survival and consider the broader implications of their actions for society as a whole. As the trials continued, the Zeltharians began to notice subtle patterns in the Deathworlders' testing. The controlled disruptions were increasingly designed to assess moral and ethical decision-making, not just technical skill. For instance, a crisis might require the Zeltharians to choose between saving a valuable technological resource or rescuing citizens trapped in a dangerous area. These challenges forced them to prioritize life over material gain, demonstrating empathy, ethical reasoning, and strategic thinking under pressure. The Deathworlders were not merely assessing survival, they were measuring the depth of the Zeltharian civilization, their capacity for wisdom, and their potential to endure as a species. Through these trials, the Zeltharians also discovered new aspects of their own society. Collaboration across cities and regions, which had once been difficult due to logistical and cultural differences, became seamless. Rivalries that had existed for generations dissolved in the face of a common goal. Knowledge sharing became a cultural norm rather than an exception, and leaders learned to rely on the collective intelligence of their people rather than solely on hierarchical decisions. The Zeltharians were learning that survival depended not just on individual brilliance, but on the strength of the entire society acting as one cohesive unit. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of rapid problem-solving under stress. The Zeltharians learned to anticipate multiple outcomes simultaneously, creating contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. When energy storms threatened a major city, for example, several teams worked in parallel. Engineers reinforced structural supports, scientists predicted storm patterns, emergency units coordinated evacuation, and communication teams relayed real-time updates. This ability to operate efficiently under extreme pressure represented a level of sophistication previously unseen in Zeltharian society. The Deathworlders' influence, though indirect, had effectively transformed the species that had once relied on comfort, stability, and predictability was now capable of extraordinary feats of innovation, coordination, and courage. Every challenge posed by the Deathworlders had been met with determination, and every success built confidence and resilience. The Zeltharians were learning not only to survive, they were learning to thrive under pressure, to evolve, and to recognize the full potential of their civilization. By the end of this period, the Zeltharians had undergone a profound transformation. Their cities were more resilient, their technologies more advanced, and their society more unified. They had learned to act collectively with precision, think creatively under pressure, and face moral and ethical dilemmas with courage and wisdom. The Deathworlders had not intervened directly, but their constant observation had forced the Zeltharians to push beyond their perceived limits. Every individual had discovered new strengths. Every community had learned to work in harmony, and the entire civilization had evolved into something greater than it had ever been before. The experience left the Zeltharians with a deeper understanding of themselves and their society. They realized that survival was not simply about avoiding destruction, it was about learning, adapting, and growing under the most extreme conditions. The Deathworlders' presence, terrifying as it had been, had catalyzed a transformation that might never have occurred otherwise. The Zeltharians had faced fear, chaos, and uncertainty, yet emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable. As the days passed, the people of Zelthera continued to adapt and innovate. They had learned that the universe was vast and often dangerous, and that survival required more than hope, it required courage, intelligence, and unity. The lessons of this period would stay with them forever, shaping not only their strategies for immediate survival but also the future of their civilization. The Deathworlders had tested them, observed them, and challenged them to become better, and the Zeltharians had risen to the occasion. They were no longer simply victims of circumstance, they were survivors, learners, and innovators, capable of meeting any challenge with determination and skill. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the Zeltharians had grown in ways they could never have imagined. The trials imposed by the Deathworlders had accelerated the evolution of their society, strengthening their intelligence, courage, and adaptability. The people had learned to act collectively, to think creatively under pressure, and to embrace challenges as opportunities for growth. They had proven, at least to themselves, that they could survive even under the most extreme conditions. And as they looked up at the fleet of silent observers above, they understood that the ultimate test was still ahead, but now they were ready. After weeks of relentless trials, the Zeltharians had reached a point of transformation unlike anything their civilization had ever experienced. The challenges imposed by the Deathworlders had tested every aspect of their society: technological ingenuity, strategic thinking, moral judgment, courage, and the ability to work together under immense pressure. Their planet, once chaotic and devastated by energy storms and gravitational disturbances, now bore evidence of a species that had adapted, evolved, and grown stronger through adversity. Cities had been reinforced, emergency systems perfected, and citizens trained to act with precision and calm under extreme stress. The Zeltharians had emerged from the crucible of trials, ready to face whatever final judgment awaited them. The purpose of their intervention had always been evaluation rather than destruction. They had observed silently, orchestrated controlled challenges, and tested the Zeltharians' intelligence, resilience, and moral character. Now, after weeks of observation, they were ready to make their assessment. The fleet that had cast long shadows over Zelthera began subtle maneuvers, signaling that the trials were nearing conclusion. Massive ships adjusted their positions, creating formations that were both imposing and symbolic, sending an unspoken message to the planet below. The Zeltharians watched with a mix of awe, fear, and anticipation, knowing that their actions over the past weeks had been under scrutiny, and that the outcome of the trials could determine the fate of their entire civilization. The final moments of the evaluation were tense. The Zeltharians understood that survival was not guaranteed merely because they had adapted and survived. The Deathworlders' judgment was not based solely on technological success or disaster avoidance. It was based on the holistic performance of the species under pressure. Were they intelligent enough to anticipate and respond to crises? Were they capable of cooperation and moral decision? Could they demonstrate courage, creativity, and resilience consistently, even under life-threatening circumstances? The Zeltharians, having learned to act collectively and decisively, now waited to see whether these efforts would be recognized and validated. During this final stage, the Deathworlders observed a particularly critical test. One of the planet's largest floating cities experienced instability due to residual gravitational fluctuations. Engineers and scientists had to act immediately to stabilize the city, but this time, the challenge was compounded. A nearby storm system threatened to cut off communication and evacuation routes, forcing leaders to make split-second decisions. The Zeltharians responded with exceptional coordination. Emergency teams were deployed to evacuate citizens, while engineers reinforced structural supports and scientists manipulated energy flows to neutralize the storm's effects. Every action was executed with remarkable precision. For the Deathworlders, this was more than a technical success. It was a demonstration of collective intelligence, leadership, and the ability to maintain composure under extreme stress. The citizens of Zel, unaware of the specifics of the Deathworlders' judgment, felt a profound mixture of relief and apprehension. They had faced immense challenges, sacrificed sleep and comfort, and risked their lives repeatedly. Families had worked together to protect their communities. Children had contributed in critical ways, and elders had guided complex decisions with wisdom honed over decades. Every individual had played a role in ensuring survival. Yet, despite these achievements, there remained an underlying fear. Would it be enough? Had they proven themselves worthy in the eyes of the most formidable civilization in the galaxy? As the observation continued, subtle signs of recognition emerged. The Deathworlders' fleet altered its formation to a pattern that could be interpreted as deliberate acknowledgement. Energy emissions shifted from aggressive, destabilizing pulses to stabilizing fields, reducing the immediate danger to the planet. It was as if the Deathworlders were signaling that they had completed their evaluation and that the Zeltharians' efforts had been noted. Citizens began to sense a change in the atmosphere, a shift from tension to cautious optimism. The trials, intense and unrelenting, were drawing to a close. Leaders of Zelthera called for a planetary gathering, not in celebration but in reflection. The society had undergone a transformation, and the people needed to process the lessons they had learned. Scientists, engineers, emergency responders, and citizens from all walks of life shared stories of courage, ingenuity, and collaboration. They recounted instances where rapid problem-solving had saved lives, where moral decisions had preserved trust and cooperation, and where ordinary individuals had performed extraordinary acts. Through these reflections, it became evident that the trials had not only tested their ability to survive but had catalyzed a cultural and societal evolution. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders prepared to depart. Their massive fleet, which had dominated the skies for weeks, began systematic withdrawal from orbit. Ships retreated in an orderly fashion, their engines leaving trails of energy that shimmered across the atmosphere. The fleet did not vanish abruptly. Its departure was deliberate, symbolic, and final. To the Zeltharians, it felt like a silent recognition of their resilience and capability. The beings that had once seemed like an unstoppable force of judgment and destruction had now acknowledged that Zelthera's civilization possessed the qualities necessary to endure in a dangerous universe. The SOS that had been sent as a desperate plea for help had transformed into a journey of proving worth and potential. As the Deathworlders disappeared into the depths of space, the Zeltharians were left with a profound sense of awe and humility. They had faced trials designed to push them to the very limits of their society, and they had survived. More than surviving, they had evolved. Their cities were stronger, their technologies more advanced, and their society more unified than ever before. They had discovered strengths in themselves and in each other that had previously been untapped. Courage, creativity, and collaboration had become defining traits of their civilization. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned that survival was not about passively hoping for rescue but about actively demonstrating resilience, intelligence, and moral strength in the days that followed. The Zeltharians reflected on the lessons learned. They had been tested not just physically, but morally, intellectually, and socially. Every individual had contributed to the survival of the species. Communities had learned to operate as integrated networks, sharing knowledge and resources with unprecedented efficiency. Leaders had learned to trust the collective wisdom of their society, rather than relying solely on hierarchical authority. Young citizens had experienced responsibility and agency in ways that accelerated their growth. Elders had witnessed the evolution of their civilization in real time, understanding that the species had achieved a new level of maturity and capability. The psychological impact of the Deathworlders' trials remained. The Zeltharians had been forced to confront fear, uncertainty, and existential risk on a scale they had never imagined. Yet these experiences had cultivated resilience. They had learned to remain calm under pressure, to think critically and strategically, and to act decisively in situations where hesitation could mean disaster. They had also learned the value of empathy and ethical decision-making, understanding that survival required not only intelligence but compassion and moral courage. These lessons would shape the future of Zelthara for generations to come. Interestingly, the Zeltharians also developed a new perspective on the universe. For the first time, they realized that survival was not guaranteed simply by intelligence or technological advancement. The galaxy was vast, filled with unknown dangers and civilizations far more powerful than themselves. The Deathworlders, though not hostile in their judgment, had demonstrated the kind of power and strategy that existed beyond their own planet. This knowledge instilled a sense of humility and preparedness. The Zeltharians understood that the universe required vigilance, foresight, and the continuous development of skills and knowledge. Survival was not a passive state, it was an active, ongoing process. As time passed, the stories of the trials spread throughout Zelth. The narratives of courage, innovation, and resilience became foundational elements of the culture. Children were taught not only scientific knowledge and history but also the lessons of collaboration, ethical decision-making, and strategic thinking under pressure. The experience with the Deathworlders became a central part of their identity, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a society could rise, adapt, and endure. The SOS that had once represented desperation now symbolized growth, courage, and the awakening of potential. Even as the Deathworlders departed, the Zeltharians felt a lingering connection to the trial. The fleet's presence, though temporary, had permanently altered the course of their civilization. They had been tested in ways that no one could have anticipated, and through that testing, they had achieved a new level of unity, intelligence, and moral development. They had survived, not through luck, but through deliberate action, courage, and the relentless pursuit of solutions to impossible problems. Every individual had played a role in this survival, and the collective effort had proven that Zelthora's civilization was capable of enduring and thriving, even in a universe of immense challenges. In the end, the SOs that had set these events in motion had accomplished far more than saving the Zeltharians from immediate destruction. It had initiated a transformation, forcing a society to confront fear, chaos, and moral dilemmas, and emerge stronger than before. The Deathworlders' judgment, delivered silently and powerfully, had recognized the Zeltharians' worthiness. Survival was no longer a matter of chance, it was a demonstration of intelligence, courage, and the ability to act collectively under pressure. The people of Zelthara had learned that their greatest strength lay not only in their technology or knowledge but in their capacity to unite, adapt, and rise to challenges beyond imagination. The Zeltharians had fully embraced their evolution. Their society had emerged from the trials stronger, wiser, and more resilient. They understood that the universe was vast, unpredictable, and often dangerous, but they also understood that they had the skills, courage, and unity necessary to thrive. The lessons of the Deathworlders' evaluation became embedded in every aspect of Zeltharian life, guiding their culture, technology, and governance for generations. And as the planet slowly returned to a state of relative calm, the Zeltharians looked up at the stars with a new understanding, recognition of the immense forces that existed beyond their world, and the knowledge that they had earned the right to continue, evolve, and endure in a universe that was as challenging as it was magnificent.